You ever get that specific kind of hollow, ringing silence in your ears right after something beautiful gets destroyed, like you're standing there looking at a piece of your own hard work turned into kindling and scrap metal for the fourth time in a month? That was me, standing at the edge of my gravel driveway in the pre-dawn mist of a Montana morning, watching the fog roll off the Bitterroot Mountains while my mail lay scattered in the mud like confetti from a party. I definitely was and oppos. T invited too. I'm telling you, there's a very particular brand of madness that sets in when you realize your peace and quiet isn't being ruined by the elements or by bad luck, but by a man with too much time, a bruised ego, and a white pickup truck that's seen better days. I moved out here to get away from the noise, bought a nice spread of land right where the suburban sprawl of Missoula starts to give up and turn into real ranch country, thinking I'd found a sweet spot between having neighbors and having a life. But I forgot one thing, and that's the fact that wherever there's a cluster of nice houses, there's usually an HOA lurking in the shadows like a bored predator, and our local chapter was run by a woman named Brenda who looked like she smelled exclusively of unsweetened lemon juice and resentment. Brenda was the end quote, president, end quote, but her enforcer, her little personal attack dog, was a guy named Chet Miller. Now, Chet wasn't an oppos, TA cop, let in oppos. Let's get that straight. He was a retired floor manager from a carpet warehouse who'd spent his entire life being told what to do and decided that his retirement was going to be the era of Chet, the lawman of the cul-de-sac. He'd drive around in this beat-up Chevy Silverado with an orange light bar on top that wasn't an oppos. T even connected to anything. Wearing a tactical vest he probably bought at a surplus store, and he'd spend his afternoons measuring the height of people's fescue or timing how long you left your trash cans out after the truck went by. I stayed out of his way for the first year, kept my head down, but things went south the day I decided to park my horse trailer in my own side yard, which was technically about 6 inches past the quote, visual harmony line in quote Chet had invented in his head. He showed up at my door, chest puffed out, radio crackling with static even though nobody was on the other end, and told me I was in quote degrading the aesthetic integrity of the ranch community, end quote. I told him as politely as a man with a deadline can to go fly a kite, and from that moment on, I had a target on my back. The first time my mailbox went down, I figured it was a teenager or maybe a distracted delivery driver, so I just went to the hardware store, bought a standard cedar post, and spent a Saturday afternoon setting it back up. 2 weeks later, I woke up to find the cedar post snapped like a toothpick and the mailbox itself flattened, almost as if someone had intentionally backed over it, then pulled forward and hit it again for good measure. I replaced it again, this time with a 4x4 pressure-treated post, thinking maybe the cedar was just too brittle, but the third time it happened, just 3 days after I finished the repair, I didn't in oppos to even feel angry at first. I just felt this cold, buzzing clarity. I went out there, picked up a damp envelope containing a birthday card for my niece, and I looked down at the tire tracks in the soft shoulder of the road, and I saw something interesting. Flecks of white paint embedded in the black plastic of my mailbox. Now, Chet drove a white Silverado with a heavy-duty steel bumper, and I'd noticed a fresh, jagged dent on the corner of that bumper during the last HOA board meeting. A meeting where Brenda had spent 20 minutes lecturing us on, in quote, property maintenance, in quote, while Chet sat in the back, smirking at me like he knew something I didn't in oppos. I went to the board and told them my federal property was being targeted, and Brenda just adjusted her glasses and said, and quote, well, if you live in a more compliant manner, perhaps these accidents would end oppos. TB so frequent, end quote, which is basically HOA speak for, end quote, we in oppos, redoing it and you can in oppos, T prove a thing, end quote. That was the spark. That was the moment I realized that if the people meant to protect the community were the ones burning it down, I wasn't in oppos. T going to get justice. By asking for it, I was going to have to engineer it. I spent the next week deep in the weeds of the county and oppos, as public works manuals and the Federal Postal Service guidelines, because I knew if I was going to fight a guy who lived for rules, I had to be the most rule-abiding person on the planet. I found the loophole I needed, the end quote, breakaway end quote, requirement. See, the law says your mailbox post has to be able to shear off if a car hits it, so it doesn't in oppos. T kill the driver, but it doesn't in oppos. T say the post can in oppos. T be made of something that looks fragile, but acts like a brick wall up to a certain point. I also set up a high-definition trail cam hidden deep inside a hollowed-out knot in an old oak tree across the road, and I waited. The footage I got on Tuesday morning at 5:45 a.m. was the nail in the coffin. I watched that white Silverado roll slowly down the road. No lights on, creeping like a ghost through the mist, and then, with a sudden, violent lurch, the truck swerved, the engine revved, and the front bumper slammed right into my mailbox. The post shattered, the truck didn't end oppose, to even stop, and Chet just rolled off into the darkness, probably feeling like a big man. I watched that clip 20 times, zooming in until I could see his face through the windshield, illuminated by the glow of his dashboard, and he was smiling. He was actually laughing. That's when I went to work. I didn't oppose, to go back to the hardware store for a 4x4 this time. I went to a local steel fabricator. I had them weld me a 3.5-inch diameter heavy-gauge steel pipe about 6 feet long, and then I spent 3 nights in my garage building what I like to call, in quote, the fortress, in quote. I dug a hole 3 feet deep, filled it with high-strength concrete, and set a sleeve for the pipe, but here's the trick. I used a, in quote, shear pin, in quote, system at the very base, right at ground level. Technically, it was a breakaway post because if a car hit it with enough force, the pins would snap. Eventually. But on top of that steel core, I built a beautiful decorative brick housing. I spent hours hand-laying every brick, making it look like a piece of high-end masonry that matched the aesthetic of the neighborhood perfectly. And inside the brick, I didn't oppose. Just for mailbox, I put a 1/4-inch thick AR 500 steel plate box that I'd custom ordered. To the casual observer, it looked like a fancy, expensive, but ultimately normal brick mailbox. But to anyone who tried to drive a truck through it, it was effectively an anti-tank bollard disguised as a place to put the Sunday paper. I finished the job on a Friday evening, wiped the mortar off my hands, and sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the sun dip behind the peaks. I knew Chet wouldn't into oppos, to be able to resist. To him, this new, beautiful mailbox wasn't into oppos. Just a target. It was an insult, a direct challenge to his authority. The following Thursday, I didn't into oppos, to even have to be awake to know it happened. The sound was like a small explosion, a deep, metallic, in quote, thud, in quote, that vibrated through the floorboards of my house, followed by the screech of tires and the high-pitched hiss of a radiator that had just given up the ghost. I put on my robe, grabbed a lukewarm cup of coffee, and walked down my driveway with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has all the time in the world. It was a beautiful sight, honestly. Chet's Silverado was angled sharply off the road. The front passenger side wheel was tucked back into the wheel well at an angle that looked very expensive. The hood was folded up like a piece of origami, and both airbags had deployed, filling the cab with that weird white dust. My mailbox. The brick housing had been shorn off, sure, and the steel post had been about 15 degrees, proving it was, in quote, breakaway, in quote, under extreme stress, but it was still standing. The mail was still inside, perfectly dry. Chet was stumbling around in the grass, clutching his wrist and coughing, his tactical vest looking a lot less intimidating now that it was covered in airbag residue. Brenda appeared out of nowhere, her bathrobe flapping in the wind, screaming about, in quote, illegal booby traps, in quote, and, in quote, reckless endangerment, in quote. She was red in the face, pointing her finger at me like a loaded gun, shouting that I was going to jail for trying to kill a, in quote, neighborhood watch official, in quote. I just leaned against my remaining fence post, took a sip of coffee, and said, in quote, morning, Brenda. Morning, Chet. Seems like the road was a bit slippery today, huh? Or maybe it was just the aesthetic integrity of the brickwork that got in your way. End quote. The cops showed up about 10 minutes later, and Brenda immediately launched into this frantic, high-pitched lecture about how I had, in quote, maliciously reinforced, in quote, my property to cause harm. I waited for her to run out of breath, and then I handed the responding officer a folder. Inside was the County Code 14B regarding mailbox construction. The receipt from the steel fabricator showing the pipe diameter was within the 4-inch limit, and a copy of the, end quote, shear pin, end quote, design that proved it was technically a breakaway post. But then I pulled out my phone and showed him the footage from the trail cam. Not just the crash from 5 minutes ago, but the footage from the week before showing Chet's previous hit and run. The officer looked at the screen, then at Chet, who was currently trying to explain to a paramedic that he was, in quote, patrolling, in quote, when a, in quote, rogue structure, in quote, jumped out at him, and then back at the screen. The officer's face went from professional to, in quote, I'm having a very interesting day, in quote, in about 4 seconds. He looked at me and said, in quote, destroying a mailbox is a federal offense, Title 18, Section 1705, and doing it with a motor vehicle while acting in a self-appointed official capacity, that opens up a whole different bag of snakes, end quote. They cuffed Chet right there, in front of the neighbors who were starting to peek out of their windows. He wasn't in Oppos, T smirking anymore. He looked small. He looked like a man who had realized too late that his little kingdom ended where my property line began. As for Brenda, the HOA board had an emergency meeting a week later after the police report went public. And let's just say she's no longer the president. In fact, she's currently being sued by 3 other neighbors for selective enforcement and harassment. I'm still out here on the edge of the mountains, and I've got a new mailbox now, built exactly like the last one, because according to the county, I'm 100% compliant. It's funny how a little bit of steel and some careful reading of the rules can change the whole energy of a neighborhood. Chet's truck was totaled, his reputation is gone, and I haven't in Oppos. T seen an orange light bar in months. But it makes me wonder, why is it that some people feel the need to break things just because they can and Oppos T control them? Is it just boredom, or is there something in us that hates seeing someone else stand their ground? I'd love to hear what you guys think. Have you ever had to deal with a, in quote, Chet, in quote, in your life? Did you find a way to fight back? Or are you still waiting for the right moment to build your own fortress? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because honestly, sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to let them run full speed into a wall of their own making. Don and Oppos, forget to like the video if you enjoyed a little bit of suburban justice, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about what happens when, in quote, quiet, in quote, neighborhoods get a little too loud. I'll see you in the next one.